Today we have with us Sanjukta Sunderason, a historian of 20th century aesthetics and art. She is the author of Partisan Aesthetics, Modern Art in India's Long Decolonization. She has also co-edited the book Forms of the Left. Her work explores the entanglements of left-wing aesthetics, decolonization, and art, particularly concentrating on South Asia. Where are you right now?
I'm in the Netherlands. I teach at the University of Amsterdam in the art history department, and I was traveling in the middle, so I came back mid-February.
So you were in
So
India?
that's why I was in India. I before that, yeah. So I was just filing my research expense claims, and it's just so irritating. So all the good things of the trips disappear and only the technical things remain. So I went to Qatar. There was an exhibition of Pakistani modern art
Oh.
there. So I saw that, and then I came to India, Delhi, and then Calcutta,
Oh, so were
where
you
I'm
here
from.
for India Art Fair?
No, 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 no. I'm a historian. I don't belong to those fancy. No, no. I have absolutely nothing to do with all of that.
No, I just
But
think
I
like a lot of
appreciate.
people were there only. That's why.
Yeah, yeah. No, I have absolutely nothing to do or say in that space. It's a different kind of. I think it is the art market
It fully
that you
is.
see there, which is fair, huh? Artists. Just a minute. What's happening here? It's the art market and its own transactions. It's, I would like to believe, very different from the kind of questions and concerns with which we as historians come to the space of art.
Definitely.
Um,
But I think all of
our
those things kind of
questions are
feed each
different.
other in some
They feed
indirect
each
way.
other. If you look back, 50 years down the line, a person like me will probably look at the Indian Art Fair and study it
Yeah.
as a kind of resource, which is, if you look at mid 20th century art practices, which is what I do, yeah, this kind of art spaces, exhibitions are spaces that we then look back at and study to understand how artists are operating in the field. What are the questions? What
But
are the
yeah,
trends?
that makes sense.
You
But
know?
I think that a lot of that is still not dictated by the economy of of the
Mm,
like that was around the art during that time because
mm,
oftentimes the things that you'll study are so specific but also things that were not very like what's the word like these were not things that were very very popular in the art market in the first place, right? Like
exactly, exactly. Yeah. No, the kind of artists I have studied, looked at in partisan aesthetics, were not artists who would be remotely relevant in the art market as such.
yeah.
Also, because the art market had a different form in the mid 20th century, it was not that
Yeah.
prominent, and even if it were, Bombay was pretty much Bombay and perhaps Delhi to a large extent were more at the center of it than other parts of India.
Yeah. um
So that kind
yeah.
of, yeah.
But even today, like it's like a lot of times the art market will not dictate what will become culturally relevant. So
No, no. That's an interesting conversation, right? That um, what does the art market do then in terms of art history or the practice of art, the discourse of art? The role of the art market is worth thinking about. In the US, for instance, in the 20th century, or other parts of in the West, where infrastructures were prominent in a particular way, there was a conversation between art market, art critical writing, who writes on artists,
yeah.
um, and therefore which artist gets written about, which artist becomes prominent. So, an artist's journey from their own practice to the space of art history requires mediators, people who will write on
Right
them,
about it.
galleries that will show them. Selling art helps because, yeah, you get money,
You
it's
get to
labor.
continue doing it.
So,
Yeah.
exactly. So these things ideally should feed into each other. But in our kind of contexts, where institutions often do not perform the roles they are supposed to perform. So, for instance, you have the National Gallery of Modern Art here and there. who collected art and displayed art, but did
Yeah.
not necessarily provide a particular kind of patronage, which might mean collecting artists' works, promoting artists. They didn't do that much. Now, private art galleries are doing it. For example, the Delhi Art Gallery, etc., etc.
Yeah.
They are doing these things. They are collecting material. They are having these big shows. They are publishing, and these are the kind of people who show up at the Indian Art Fair. So there is an interesting dialogue between the art fair and research, but
Yeah.
the agents are not who you would expect to be the agents. The agents are often private
Definitely.
collectors,
And the yeah.
businessmen.
And that does lead to problems also because, so if it were a governmental institution doing it, then it's much easier to facilitate the conversation between historians and researchers and the art market.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
with private institutions, and I'm just speaking from personal experience here, like Delhi Art Gallery, I don't think their archive is very robust. Like they don't have all accurate information about the pieces that are part of their collection. They don't have like a digital
Sure.
archive for you to refer to and things like
No.
that.
Plus access. They don't provide access by
Yeah.
default. So these are all serious issues. So that's why my reaction to the Indian art fair was like, no, I yeah, there are many art historians, you see, also work with contemporary art, which is what I don't. So I have very little to say about the space of contemporary art because I come to the whatever I do from the concerns of a historian, which in the past I had to struggle with, trying to understand, am I writing history or am I writing art history?
Yeah.
In the sense, who is the main protagonist in my story? Is the artist the protagonist or is the historical time the protagonist? And
Yeah.
these are two different things. Of course, they can speak to each other. So that dialogue is worth having. That how does an artist speak to their time? Is the artist influenced by the time or is the artist trying to influence the time? You see?
Yeah.
That's an interesting. That dialogue is, we often take that dialogue for granted. Perhaps we shouldn't.
Yeah. And it's a very difficult one to kind of you talk about this in your book also, about who is the protagonist. Yeah.
Who's the protagonist and also what is the relation? We talk
Yeah.
about political art. We try to understand, is art influencing politics or politics influencing art? But maybe that's not the question. Maybe the question is, how is this relation? What is the form of
Yeah.
this relation? And the form of that relation to me, eventually, when I was thinking about the book, not thinking, struggling with the book, I came up with the idea of partisan aesthetics, which to me was the form of that relationship.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that? So you felt like there was something missing in the way we discussed the relationship between politics and art. But is then like partisan aesthetics a framework for thinking about art that is not just about like decolonization or not just existing in those very specific contexts of the global south, but is this something that can be applied to the way you think about like political art in everywhere?
I see what you mean. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very good way of looking at it. That is it something that's unique to the global south, or is it a larger theoretical framework that can be taken to, other places and times, and not necessarily marked by the experience and politics of decolonization, right?
Yeah.
I would say yes, ideally, because when I say that it's actually not whether artists are influenced by politics or not whether, oh, is this propaganda art or not? To me, that's not the point. The point is, how is the relation between artists and politics or artists and historical time? How is that relationship developing, falling apart, coming together again? And relationships are not very stable things. They are, because they are drawn by inspiration that involves disenchantment. So enchantment and disenchantment and obsession, rejection, refusal. These are different kinds, if you will, or different expressions of relationship.
Yeah.
And between the terms of politics and the terms of artistic creation, that relationship has happened,
Yeah.
but not by subsuming each other into one. So ultimately, it is that relationship that is more interesting to me than who is on this side and who is on that
Yeah.
side.
That
So
makes
in that sense, you could say that partisan aesthetics could be a framework to study relationality of art and politics rather than what is propaganda art or what is political art. And there's so much work on that, right? There is so much theoretical work
yeah.
on that. Not necessarily from the global south, there isn't that much because the questions are very different in that field even now. But overall, overall, 19th, 20th century, if you see, the politicality of art, that is what I think partisan aesthetics could contribute to if people were interested. And I see that people are, particularly PhD scholars who are trying to theorize art and politics,
Yeah.
they are finding it useful.
Yeah.
You as a student, you are finding it useful. So that's very interesting to see that people who are in the process of developing their ideas are finding it useful. And then we see where it goes, you know.
Yeah.
That's where, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
this is especially like important when you think about who gets like what kind of artists get included in that like explicitly political spaces versus implicitly political spaces.
Absolutely.
Because if you only look at what is propaganda versus what is not, that is something that is very institutionalized. So you can't actually study like maybe more something that's more geared towards what was more broadly happening in culture, because I think that even though propaganda might be effective, there is often a recognition of the fact that it is propaganda while it is being disseminated. So,
Very much so.
yeah. How does this relate? Like, how does partisan aesthetics then like allow you to actually research or talk about those implicit political spaces or those like
Oh, yeah.
irregular ways in which art that
Yeah.
influences politics manifests?
Yeah. Well, to me, partisanship is a very irregular idea because it is irregular because it is a sense of belonging
Yeah.
or wanting to belong.
Yeah.
And wanting to belong means that you're trying to belong to something that inspires you, but that something is not static in itself. What, let's say, socialism means, or what Marxism means, or what even communism means, might be not always exactly the same as what the Communist Party means.
Yeah.
You see, between were not artists who would be remotely relevant in the art market as such. Also, because the art market had a different form. You might be very inspired by communist ideology, socialist ideology, but a consolidation of that ideology in the hands of the party and the state makes it official.
Yeah.
So the energy of opposition and critique that the ideology offers you, the party doesn't, because
Yeah.
the party wants you to follow. And not just the party, I would say the party in power.
Yeah.
Yeah, the state expects you to follow that. So the same set of artists who would have that sense of partisanship, belonging, commitment
Yeah.
might go through instability. So it doesn't mean that my desire to believe in that ideology has disappeared. It just means that I'm struggling with that belief.
Yeah.
So you as a historian, art historian, whatever you call it, if you cannot capture that struggle,
Yeah.
then something is missing in that narrative.
Definitely.
Art historians might or might not be interested in that narrative. They might be interested in the artistic form. But historians might be interested in that. Or maybe not. So so there is this middle space then of writing on art, which then I think needs to pay attention to what the instabilities. So when an artist both believes in something and resists it
Yeah.
at the same time, which is so much the case, particularly in post-colonial societies, if I narrow it down now from a larger space of art, politics, etc., to, let's say, art, politics, etc., in post-colonial, late colonial, decolonizing contexts, there the political is complicated because it's not just the party ideology, etc. It's also this amorphous idea of the nation and the nation state. So, your critique of the idea of the nation state or critique of the nation state is often tempered by the fact that you didn't even have a nation state. So you have it now. You are critical of what it is doing or how it is treating, let's say, minorities or margins of the nation state. But at the same time, you are also very committed to building that nation state that didn't even exist. So that is something that's curious to Nehruvian India, very different in Bangladesh, Pakistan, to be honest. But in India, there is that belief in the Nehruvian nation state. Now, if you ask people from margins of the same country, they might give a very different view of the Nehruvian nation state than mainlanders, if you will. And when we write these histories, often we forget those dissonant spaces.
Definitely.
And if you were to write histories from those dissonant spaces, you have to deal with that contradiction, in particular in those spaces, that contradiction of artists that both want to believe in the idea of a benevolent state, but at the same time cannot unsee political artists who are engaged in politics. Not all artists are. So, and they have to then engage with the contradictions. And so what do they do with that critique?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, how do they portray the self in relation to the idea of the nation? Is it a happy relation? Is it a contradictory relation? Is it a painful relation?
Yeah.
So all this to say that idea of partisanship, of course, can be tied to a political ideology, but perhaps something more can be done there, streamlining more to the idea of post-colonial modernism, where we assume that post-colonial modernism has a particular kind of positive relation to the arrival of the post-colonial nation state. Now, that might not always be a positive relation, or rather, post-colonial nationalism might also have, post-colonial modernism might also be a space where artists are working out what the nature of the post-colony is. Or rather, what is the nature of this freedom that we have received, or what is the nature of this independence that we have received? This is what I'm working on now. So that's why I'm thinking about this now more.
Mm-hmm.
But it is that contradiction that we assume an affirmative position when it comes to post-colonial modernism, that we are representing our tradition, we are going back to our roots, we are building for the new nation. There are artists and art practices that are, sure, they are also building, but they are also dealing with what has been broken apart. You see? That's the thing that I feel. There has to be a set of questions to capture that.
Yeah, I agree with that. You said something about how people at basically people, even if they were not committed to the Nehruvian idea of the nation state, there is still a positive relation that they have with the idea of building a nation and building a state. Do you see this as something that is basically, do you see this the fact that this happens in post-colonial states is something that continues within the political spaces? So with Nehru, for example, even if people were not, even if artists and there were broad parties that did not agree with his ideology, they were still committed to those kinds of politics. Is that kind of thing something that you see, we see that still exists today with, say, the BJP? And do you think that's something that is being passed down?
Yeah, well, my instinctive reaction would be to say no. But that's also because, see, it's a tricky question. Because there are ways in which nation states, always try to have a footprint in the field of art.
Yeah.
They want that affirmation from the field of art practice.
Yeah.
Some states want affirmation. Some states want towing the line. Rather, some states want support. It's a positive thing. Some other states want you absolutely not to do anything other than affirmation. You see, that is the difference, because speaking to the government, speaking to a national idea, particularly in post-colonial conditions, societies where the experience of the nation state is fairly new. India is not even 100 years, the Indian nation state is not even 100 years old. So, we can critique India, etc. But it's worth keeping that in mind, that some of the contradictions that are playing out now were historically, it's not shocking.
Yeah.
It's not shocking to me that people now want to celebrate majoritarian identities. It is in the DNA of the country. It is in the DNA. There is so much violence that has constituted the making of the nation.
Yeah.
That violence will come up. And if there are people who can purge that, sure, but it will come up, and that's tragic. So with the BJP, etc., it's not about what affirmation it needs. It's about what it censors, and not just censor, what it will penalize.
Yep.
And I will say, perhaps in Nehruvian India, there were parts of the country where certain kinds of anti-national, quote-unquote, activities were penalized. If you are looking at Nehruvian India from Northeast India or Kashmir, you will see a very different version of the country.
Yeah, definitely.
But maybe now that is happening in mainland India, that is happening in Delhi, and so on, and the intellectuals are shocked, etc., and we should be. So, in other words, it's not about what we as cultural producers are affirming.
Yeah.
But it's about what we cannot do. It's not about what we can do, but it's about what we cannot do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Repression is real in a way in India of the past 10, 15 years. That was not the case earlier. We just have to accept that. That doesn't mean there was no repression. But what we see now is way more structural. As we look at it in the world, it's not the first time America is terrorizing the world. It always has. But it has done so in the garb of civility.
Yeah.
That garb is removed now. So that's exactly the case between Nehruvian India and BJP. So, and then some. I mean, we are openly majoritarian now. We were not openly majoritarian.
We were majoritarian, but secretly.
Huh?
I was making a joke. I said we were majoritarian, but secretly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, majoritarian, but secretly. So, I really believe that. I'm not invested in nation state. I really don't care. But there are both similarities, uncanny similarities.
Yeah.
And obvious dissimilarities. Does that make sense? We know how it is different. Yeah. What we do not know and pay attention to is how it is actually not that different. But to understand that, we have to speak to other stakeholders, indigenous people, Dalits, minorities, and they might have a different story of this.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. So there is an unevenness. But yeah, artists towing the line for many reasons. The institutions, the cultural apparatus.
Yeah.
You don't see that much artists towing the line, but yeah, sure. Maybe they toe the line to the market. And the issue with contemporary India is that between the state and the market, there is an unholy entente. So if you follow the market, you are by default have to toe a particular line. Increasingly.
Can you explain a little more what you mean by the market, or like following the market?
Because it is a combination of a government and the market.
Yeah.
Right? Who controls the industry, or who controls the state, which was not the case earlier that much in India. So now if you look at media, media, market, and state, look at how
Yeah,
big media and big capital is operating.
definitely.
If you see that, then it will become clearer how the state market apparatus is operating. So if you and I are cultural producers, artists, performers, etc., and we have and we are resistant to the powers that be, but we will have to do all kinds of maneuvers
Yeah,
to continue to practice and not be jailed, and B, not only practice, but practice with some degree of acceptance, critical appreciation, visibility, not having our exhibitions bombed, all kinds of things. So these things were not there. So this is what I'm saying. This was not there earlier.
yeah,
There might have been other things,
yeah.
but those other things need more research.
This is,
Ironically, we are at a time when we both have to go back to Nehruvian India critically and defend it at the same time.
that is interesting. Do you think it's like cyclical in some way, this idea of state repression and then state, like more freedom and then more repression? Because a lot of tactics that, say, are present in Indian politics right now with concerns to culture are similar ones that were present just at the cusp of independence, just before it. So, do you see this as like a trajectory that will continue, and like you'll have to renegotiate like cultural freedom over and over again in the long run?
Yeah. I'm actually reminded of what a taxi driver was it Delhi? I think it was Bombay. Told me, and I often talk to them, and I was talking about this and that. And he said, I was talking about the state of the country and all of that, and he said, Madam, sabr kijiye. What does sabr mean? It's waiting, patience, but waiting with patience.
Yeah.
But it also means having a larger view of time. So because you asked the point about cyclical time, is it cyclical? I would like to say at an esoteric level, yes, it is cyclical. But that's not an esoteric renunciation of politics, but rather having a larger, as a historian, a more secular way of looking. That's the only way I know. A more secular way of looking at this idea of sabr is basically have a larger, a longue durée perspective. And when you see the longue durée perspective, it doesn't mean that what's happening now is just a part of a cycle and we will go out of it. But no, there is a larger dialectical movement of post-colonial transition, and this is organic to that transition, and we have to fight it while having that longue durée perspective.
Yeah.
And by fighting it, I do not mean just fighting the state. I also mean fighting our friends and family. Maybe fighting is not a word, maybe dialogue is a word. To have that understanding where people's anxieties are taken on board and not told that that this is fascist, because it often is. But the only way of proceeding is, I think it needs some longue durée historical understanding. And I think that historical understanding is indispensable if one has to come out or protect India or whatever from this moment.
That makes sense.
And people who are in vulnerable positions know that.
Yeah.
They know that.
Definitely.
That's why a minority taxi driver in Bombay is telling me, Madam, sabr kijiye, right?
Yeah, because I think it's that, plus they know that there is nothing they can do, so they must
There is nothing
wait.
you can do. There is nothing you can do. There are maybe lots of things you can do.
But in those vulnerable positions...
Yeah, in those vulnerable positions, you have a particular understanding of temporality, which is very interesting to me. You have that scale of time. And I think that scale of time is an important one, because you see, what is actually being attacked is that scale of time. It is history that is being attacked.
Yeah.
So it is history that will save you. Right? So it is that temporality that one has to somehow hold on to and bring into our thinking more. And yeah, I do not know how to do that. I just know that's something we have to do, and we do not necessarily have the tools or understanding for that.
Yeah.
Again, I'm somebody who's based outside India. If I were somebody based in India teaching in Delhi, where a student might complain about you if you talk about the caste system, and that goes to the principal, and the principal comes to you and you lose your job, that would be a very different position to be in.
Definitely.
So maybe some of the things that I'm saying are abstract, but yeah, they are raw and abstract. So take it as they are.
Yeah. You talked about You talked about like the scale of time and like looking to your history. So is that something like, I had two questions. So first is like, is that something that you see like that is like characteristic of the kinds of art and visual languages that's being created at the cusp or like during the process of decolonizing? And the second thing is how do you see like art in general change with this like cycle? So with this kind of negotiation, how does art align? Like, what are like indicators to you as when you've studied the process of art realigning itself with the state apparatus and disaligning itself and all those things? So are there specific signs of that in the visual world?
I mean, it would depend on which context we are talking about. These are so contextual. And the way the West wants us to see artists aligning themselves with an ideology and a state is uniquely their issues. That is not how things necessarily operated in a decolonizing world, where that state was not a given. You align yourself with the state when the state is your patron in some way.
Yeah.
Our states were not patrons. Our states only came into being in the mid-20th century, wanted to be patrons, and were patrons in big ways. For example, in India, in Senegal, etc., where 30% of the budget under, were part of Senegal. So, when the state became the patron, artists wanted that patronage.
Yeah.
Not because they are statists, but because they would like some patronage. Right?
Yeah.
So that aligning and disaligning with the state is something to nuance a little bit. Big transition points, if I were to think aloud, and I really appreciate these questions, so allow me slightly slower response.
Of course.
Big points, I would say the 50s. Or 50s in India, maybe I would say the first 10, 15 years of independence. Often you find a more affirmative relation because things are being built.
Yeah.
But as it happened, many of these early post-colonial states eventually became dictatorships.
Yeah.
Because the people in power thought only they could solve the problem. Also because external powers, the United States in most cases, in their anti-communist pursuit, upholded some people, opposed others, assassinated people, all kinds of things happened. So very soon in the, let's say, the second or third decade of independence in the global south, in many countries, I'm talking about 20th century independence movements, not Latin America necessarily, you would find that there is some kind of confusion, disenchantment. Many of these artists are imprisoned by those same leaders.
Yeah.
For example, an artist like Ingi Aflatun in Egypt, a Marxist, a socialist, was imprisoned by Nasser, one of the important, presidents of socialist. So, and there are many other examples.
Yeah.
So there is that tension that what you support can also swallow you.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea is then a state. The idea of independence is then an independent state, and you might be a dissident voice. Rather, your affirmation is accepted, your dissidence is not. So you often see that. India is a different story because India, you didn't really see that kind of political art coming up at a national level till the national emergency in the mid 70s, and there it becomes clear there is opposition, Indira Gandhi and all of that. So I could then say that there could be three phases, and I'm thinking about the larger decolonizing world, not necessarily India, where the earlier period of affirmation, right after independence, often leads to an unstable period where artists are often imprisoned, often they are disenchanted, multiple things. Many of them leave. And then there could potentially be, I'm not saying these are the three phases, but I'm saying there could potentially be a third phase where you find artists moving away from the space of political art and searching for a very, very modernist, abstract vocabulary that both contains their political opposition, but kind of refreshes it.
That
so
makes
that
sense.
The opposition can no longer be identifiable as opposition. Right?
Yeah.
And that is an artistic strategy in itself.
It is.
And that doesn't mean that way of existing would not happen in the first phase. Sure, if you look, then you will find it. But I'm giving you a very generic kind of structure because in the 60s and 70s, you see a lot of political art globally. But you also see in countries that had relative stability earlier, like India, political art not only emerging, but emerging within the distinctive space of modernist form. That's why when we think of art and politics, we talk about emergency, because then the artistic works are visible, people are writing about them, they are more exciting. But my whole point is that there was political art before that also. It's just that they were not written about or exhibited. They were happening in the margins, while at the national level you had M.F. Hussain, right? A particular vision of a revitalized rural India, epic form for a new India. So that narrative of promise was there in India earlier. I hope all that makes sense.
It does. It's really interesting to think about.
Multiple scales.
Especially what you talked about, where like you make your critique, or you make the politics more implicit, or you make it more difficult to find. I think that's very interesting to think about, because even that is cyclical. So that happens in multiple spaces, and it happens with a lot of identities that are not like strictly political. So if you kind of make art about, say, sexuality in 20th century Europe, so those kinds of things, but also you pointed to like M.F. Hussain, and that like led me to think about how is there like imbalances in the ways that rural communities are, especially in India, or like in the context of the global south, which is like largely more developing countries, more agrarian people. Do you feel like there's a broader sense of like romanticizing that happens when you talk about that kind of political art, or like art that is specifically dealing with, taking pride in those kinds of aspects of your countries, or things like that?
Whether that is more prominent in the countries of the global south. I think yes, it is more prominent. And not just because Europe loses touch with its own roots in rural communities, mythology. It's Europe loses that for sure, and there is a particular kind of coming of industrial modernity that cleanses European. So that's happening in the decolonizing part of the world. That rupture has not happened. So it's a very different. So while you have the rapid development of urban centers, it is happening from above. And the sense of displacement is stronger. So even in the 19th century, when you had rapid industrialization happening, you have the movement Romanticism, which was about the rural. It was about a pure self. Either it became a pure self, or it became about the pure rural. So a search for something that is untouched by this malicious, smoky industrial revolution. So in the post-colonial context, you often have that returning to the rural. In the early 20th century, returning to the Partha has written about it, right, on primitivism, that you return to the rural to find a core of a self and a nation that is untouched by urban colonial modernity. In the post-colonial nation, I would say that return to the rural is a search for, if you look at Hussein, it is a search for epic form. Like that the India is a continuity, there is a continuity of the rural and the nation. And that is something that fits the national agenda really well.
Yeah.
Like, why not? Sure, we have that. So the folk, craft, art, all of it together. So that happens, that celebration of the rural happens. And one of the things that in partisan aesthetics, at least, I tried to follow was how a particular idea of a revolutionary popular, a people that are resisting, a people that are potentially revolutionary, gets almost sanitized in Nehruvian India as a people that are just rural and who are the carriers of India's true identity. So that depiction of the rural becomes an affirmative depiction rather than the rural as a site that is resisting.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because a lot of, and that's also the Communist Party's projection, but not entirely, the whole energy of popular movements in the 1940s that finds expression in art disappears in the 50s, 60s. Now, we can say that, it disappears, but look, in the 70s we have political art. But my question is, sure, we have political art in the 70s, but why did it disappear in the 50s and 60s? So that's the question. To see a gap and then ask, why is the gap there?
Yeah. So...
and my sense is that the gap is there because, nobody wants to talk about partition in India. India is so big, partition doesn't even affect it at a national level. I'm half Tamil, so I can tell you it's not a thing in South India.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And B, people want to believe. People want to believe. They know what Nehru has done. Nehru imprisons 90% of the Communist Party after coming to power. People still believe. People still join the Lalit Kala Academy. They join the Sahitya Academy. Most of the former communists, they did that. Because they want to believe. They want to build this nation.
Yeah.
And that affirmation maybe erodes particular edges of critique that they might have had, or they probably made those critiques deeply personal. And maybe the critiques hid in other narratives already then.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm interested in figuring out, how people deal with both hope and disenchantment at the same time.
That's really beautiful,
right?
Yeah.
So at the same time that is happening. And particularly if you're looking at politically charged cultural thinkers, producers, they are dealing with that dialectic of hope and disenchantment. It is not, this is my hopeful phase, and then I thought, this is not going anywhere. I'm disenchanted. It is that entanglement, I think, that we need to find a theoretical vocabulary for, and we don't have it yet.
Makes sense.
I think that is where cultural theory from decolonization should go to.
Yeah.
Let's find out how that double consciousness, if you will, operates. And then some artists will lend themselves to that doubleness more than others. That doesn't mean this artist is more political than the other or more special politically than others, but that's just how it is. But what I am increasingly thinking about is decolonization and post-colonial modernism has so often been this narrative of promise and affirmation. But decolonization is a process that is rife with displacement, war, partition, genocide, you name it. It can't be that in theoretical vocabulary, aesthetic vocabulary, we don't have any understanding of that rupture. Where is all that rupture going in art?
right?
Yeah.
And propaganda art is not good enough to say, oh, of course that rupture is there in the drawings of Vietnamese, the Viet Cong fighters in the Mekong Delta, but that's also an aesthetic,
Yeah.
you know. So those are questions that I am trying to work out now and
It's,
not succeeding.
no, I'm sure you are. You're being humble. You talked about the partition and how you're looking at how the partition affected art and political art. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I do think there is maybe a lack of like acknowledgement about artists from the partition, just because like a lot of these people were like you said, they wanted to believe and they wanted to have hope, but then we saw a generation of artists that were maybe indirectly affected by the partition come up like 20 years later and down the line. So I'm particularly thinking about like people like Melanie, but yeah. So how are you figuring that part out?
Yeah, well, the earlier generation artists like Bhavesh Sharnal, etc., who I'm working on, he was the founder of the Delhi Shilpi Chakra, a very important name in the art scene in Delhi. Art scene in the sense, an institution maker. Or you have Satish Gujral, etc., who were displaced by partition. Like they actually had to move from the newly formed Pakistan, etc. They moved from Lahore to here and all of that, and vice versa. In a very different way. Yeah, so and they didn't want to address that. I mean, Satish Gujral did, but it needed the aesthetic inspiration from Mexico.
Yeah.
For him to find that book. Then you have, Parashar. I've been following people writing on Parashar. It's here somewhere. But I'm also trying to understand, there are artists who did. It's just that we so far didn't know about them. We knew about a Satish Gujral and so on. So there are artists who did, but it somehow never became a thing nationally in the conversation. So maybe one has to make a differentiation between what people did and what got shown. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
In Bengal, where I'm from, you had artists like Jogan Chaudhary, etc., who did a lot of partition work. Recently, the works of another artist, Ganesh Halui, nobody would associate him with that kind of work, but he had that. So it is about more of these works coming out in the public sphere so that scholars see. Many of these works are not there in the public domain. That's worth making a point around. But I also see, in general, in the field of cultural production, artists did not talk about it, did not do it. Maybe because it was too raw to the event. Maybe it was because it was too raw and it was too close to the event, and maybe that, but I do think the promise of Nehruvian India, which is very different from that in Pakistan, did something to foster or contain that disenchantment, smoothing the edges. Bengal is a very different story, Punjab is a very Delhi, but it's very different how partition refugees were settled, rehabilitated. That also played a role in how the partition will stay on, So that's very different. For generations, 2 or 3 generations down the line, Nalini, Malani, etc., that is a good distance to reflect back on something that happened. Maybe 50s was not the time for that. Maybe the trauma was too stark.
Yeah.
I don't know. But what happens what happens with partition also, and this is not fully thought out, but I'm just saying, the biggest trauma, of course, on both communities, but a community that had to leave would be the community that would produce that art.
Yeah.
Except that we do not know that community because these two countries never really worked together on thinking about what was partition.
And it's...
So what I'm saying is that the narrative of partition itself, the imagination of partition is as fragmented as the experience and history of that partition. It is as if people do not that expression can also not come. That's my reflection. But yeah, I don't know. In literature, it's there. Maybe in literature it works differently.
Yeah.
You know.
My issue with that is like, if you think about it, the Bengal famine was like a similarly violent event, time of crisis, but art from it is like, it was very immediate, like the reaction was very immediate. And is that just because the people who were involved in producing that art were not directly affected by it?
I would say yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I would say yes. And because you could portray, you were not in an upheaval yourself.
Yeah.
Well, your city was in an upheaval. You still had food to eat.
Yeah.
So that is then the challenge of representation. Who represents? Maybe partition is a crisis of representation then.
Yeah.
And you cannot do that, and you cannot do a partition iconography till you actually are far removed from it.
But like, why is that the case? Because you can still, if you still see, I feel like you can still see a partition happening, similar to. But I guess the violence, like the experience of the violence from it is missing,
Violence,
or something.
whether you want to, what you want from art, and again, this point about affirmation. Do you want to hold on to affirmation? Do you want to affirm, or do you want to lament?
Yeah.
So there's a deeply human story then there. It's not just a story of representation, art, etc., but a deeply human story of, whether you want to affirm or whether you want to lament.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
You know. Yeah. So maybe that's something. But it's a question, I mean, I love the question mainly because I don't have an answer to it. And it's also a question I ask myself. And now in my current book project, I'm working with partition more. Not as partition, but as displacement more broadly. And there, this point about why. So partition creates a sense of disorientation.
Yeah.
And an art of that disorientation is an art that wants to find place and not remain with the displacement. Does that make sense? That the art that wants to find place, that who am I, who are we, what is this nation, rather than what just happened.
Yeah, it's like less of a place of anger and more confusion.
More confusion, and that confusion is something very serious.
Yeah.
And you cannot blame people. But why are you not radical in 1952? Because I'm. So that's the thing. So one has to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Plus, again, we need to look at non-modernist, raw works of our artists. If we do not do that, we are going to come up with stuff like this. If you go around really looking at private collections, people, if it's made available to scholars like you, then you will see, Hussein did all these works, or Raza did all these works before leaving. All of these things, you need to see that to do artistically rigorous argumentation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you will have historically resonant, theoretical ruminations from people like me who probably who have not seen it all. Maybe it's not possible to see it all. But based on what one sees, which is not that bad either, like a journal like Marg, where is partition there?
Yeah.
Where did it go? So there are ways in which there are reasons why people like us are saying this, or people like you are saying this. But maybe there are things that we have not seen yet. Or maybe there's nothing to see.
Maybe there isn't.
Maybe there's nothing to see.
What is just to wrap this up, but what is the process like of trying to collect information that you just like simply doesn't know whether it exists or not, or it's just made intentionally difficult for you to find. So not having access to works from people other than just people that were state sponsored or were famous already, how does that affect like broader research about the partition? Obviously,
How
like
access to
yeah,
material, you mean?
yeah,
It's very difficult. It's very difficult because we hardly have any official institutional collections or artist estates that are out there trying to show us, or big foundations that control artist estates. And that is not how capital operates.
yeah,
In many parts of the global south, etc. It's different in the Middle East because of the challenges they have had, plus their oil altogether. You know, there are big foundations who have collected stuff and who. So that's one thing. Maybe in terms of art, that helps.
yeah,
That when there is a very strong challenge, the defense is also strong. In our case, it's pretty flat. Nothing happens. Nobody bothers. So a big part of South Asia is that.
Yeah.
It is somewhat bizarre that it's in 2024 that the first big exhibition of Pakistani modern art happens. That also not in Pakistan but in Doha. So and similarly in
Yeah.
India. So India is very different in that case. But so access is a serious issue.
yeah,
But if you stay with it, there is a way in which serendipity operates, chance encounters, one person leading to the next. So it's a very informal process.
yeah,
And that informal process is worth believing in. But once you do that and you start a new book project like I'm doing now, you have the same range of anxieties again that, oh, will this person show me? Will I get whatever? You try
Yeah.
to reach somebody and tell them, do you know this one's daughter and that one's that? And then you go to the houses of these children of artists and they're like, oh, mom's whatever is in the basement, or I don't have anything, but maybe there's a trunk in the attic with dad's stuff. And then you go, it's full of gas bills and passport photos and maybe some catalogs from 1943. You see? So it's a very random process
yeah,
with some logic, but not too much either. You know, like you know why you are in that space. What you don't know is what you will find or
Yeah.
what you will not find. So, and that is quite. It's very different if you're working on Hussein or any other big artist. Then there's an artist estate and they might be more open and blah blah. Suppose you're working on Nalini Malani.
Yeah.
It's a completely different story. She's an intellectual. She's generous. You go, but that's not the case always. And particularly if you're working with artists who are dead, which is what I do, it's another level of mayhem.
yeah,
And many of these artists I worked on were not particularly public. They were not that interested. So that becomes a hard thing. So then you count on discourse a lot. You look at periodicals. In my case, vernacular periodicals were very important. Regional periodicals that could be
Yeah.
both in English or Bengali in my case. My sense is that if one reads languages like Marathi, etc., there would be a gigantic vernacular sphere
Yeah.
of conversation there. Some states have that more than others. So that space of vernacular or regional art discourse becomes very important. So at one level you build your archive,
Yeah.
because it's not a given what is an archive here. It is changing. I don't want to say that that's not the case. It is changing. But how much changes change?
yeah. I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these things would be easier if museums and like state archives and places had digital archives and, you know,
Yeah.
things that were well documented online. But it's
And
just
you'll be
impossible.
surprised. You'll be surprised. We in India, we think that, we are, the next big thing. But it's... I recently was in Pakistan and I had to work at the National College of Art. They have digitized everything. They have an archive that is like, I don't even know. It's like a 10 square meter room, or maybe it's a small room. And then there is another set of 2 rooms behind that. with all these files, and they have been digitizing. There is a girl sitting in a corner doing the work who can't even breathe because the air quality is 1700. So I'm just saying there are ways in which one can do this. And they are doing it. There is no major patronage. So you don't need you need people with vision, and you need some kind of support.
Yeah.
And basically you need people with vision and interest. Mm-hmm. And if you think you're already so great that everybody, then it's a non-starter.
Yeah.
So it's a conservational work,
Yeah.
You have to
definitely.
You have to you first have to realize that, what I have, I might lose, and therefore I might have to protect it.
Yeah.
But if you already feel that you have everything, then it's difficult. Or you don't care, like the National Gallery. They don't care. They have so much.
I would die if I got to see the room with Amrita Sehgal's paintings at the gallery.
Exactly. Well, it's so, I went to their storage, and they show you a few notebooks. They did show me Nandalal Bose's notebooks. But my God, it was so hard to go through that process. And mainly as an early researcher, as a PhD researcher, or whatever, MA, MPhil researcher, early on.
Yeah.
You might not have the confidence to go and, throw yourself at these bureaucrats. And you might not have that. You might just be a researcher who wants to really look at this.
Yeah.
So where is the apparatus to make that possible?
Yeah.
That's not there. So that's a problem. And that's a problem that's there in South Asia everywhere.
That's fair.
I was shown stuff at the NCA because I was a foreigner. And therefore, people were more open to showing me stuff than they would to
this is definitely, student. I think this is definitely true.
Yeah. So there are these angles there also. So archive is a very fraught thing in terms of access. We can talk about its importance, but what's the point of talking about its importance in this particular field? Well, nobody makes an effort to make it available.
Yeah, I think that's quite important.
That's where big capital should go. I mean, art fair is great, but that's where big art capital should go. That let's make this available.
Yeah.
The Delhi Art Gallery seems to have ideas, but let's see.
I love how we wrapped this up with the same place that we started.
We did.
Yeah.
We did.
Thank you so much.